Les croyances que nous avons sur divers groupes démographiques sont, contrairement à ce que nous entendons continuellement, souvent vraies. Voici ce qu'a conclu mon invité dans cet épisode, le psychologue Jussim, après avoir épluché la littérature scientifique à la recherche des preuves de l'affirmation contraire, sans cesse répétée, mais apparemment jamais justifiée. The beliefs that we have about various demographics are, notwithstanding what we are relentlessly told, often accurate. This is what my guest in this episode, psychologist Jussim, concluded after thoroughly reviewing the literature in search of evidence for the opposite claim, which is incessantly repeated but never bolstered by evidence. Okay, so I'm thrilled to be here with Professor Jussim. So Professor, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
Right. So you're a professor at Rutgers University.
Yes.
And you conduct your research in the Department of Psychology.
Yep.
And so your research has covered topics such as self-fulfilling prophecies, stereotypes, and political bias in social psychology.
Yep.
You are the author or editor of several books, including Social Perception and Social Reality, which was published in 2012,
yep.
and won the American Association of Publishers Prize for Best Book in Psychology.
Yep.
You also you saw another book. This one you edited with Joseph Forges and Paul van Lange. It's The Social Psychology of Morality, published very recently in 2016. So we can start the conversation by talking about self-fulfilling prophecies, because it's something that skeptics, skeptics in the sense of maybe James Randi and Penn and Teller and Richard Dawkins, people like this, they like to talk about this. And the way a skeptic might understand this notion is that, if I believe, for instance, that something is destined to be true, then I will act in a way that is likely to result in that something becoming true. So belief in the prophecy will have helped fulfill that prophecy. So that's the self-fulfilling part.
Yes.
So many psychologists seem convinced that other people's beliefs also about the future, for instance, my own future, will influence me deeply in a similar way. So other people's beliefs might influence me. So, for instance, one could talk about teachers' expectations of students' performance. So, can you explain what you found in your research about this topic?
Yeah, well, that research had sort of a disciplinary split personality. So, if you read the 1970s, 1980s, even 1990s social psychology of self-fulfilling prophecies, you got these soaring narratives emphasizing their power and pervasiveness. And you still see that. And included, not the only thing in that, but included in that was the idea that self-fulfilling prophecies were a major source of social inequality.
Mm-hmm.
So you have that over there on the social psychology side. In educational research and educational psychology research, where they were always much more quantitatively oriented than social psychology, and that might be changing now, but it certainly was true in the 70s and 80s, there was a very early recognition that two things were true. That the main reason teacher expectations predict student achievement is not self-fulfilling prophecy. It was because teachers were accurate. They knew which kids were more successful, more competent, smarter, whatever it might be. And as a result, teachers' expectations were sort of nicely in touch with reality. They did predict students' future achievement, but it was primarily because they were accurate. Now, but that's saying primarily. Even in the educational literature, what was clear was that there was pretty consistent evidence that teacher expectations could become self-fulfilling prophecies, and did with some regularity, but in general, the effect was pretty weak and pretty easily eliminated. So you had these two soaring narratives, these two sort of competing narratives. And I kind of stepped in, not really fully understanding it when I first started doing it as a graduate student, but it quickly became clear that in this particular case, the educational researchers and the educational psychologists knew what they were talking about, and the social psychologists were just telling stories. That's really what it came down to. Mm-hmm. And that's whether it's in experimental lab work, whether it's in teachers' expectations and students, or any other context. In general, there are occasional exceptions, but in general, self-fulfilling prophecies seem like they're real. Most studies that look for them find at least some evidence of self-fulfilling prophecies, but the effect size was, on average, really quite small. So that was sort of the upshot of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so could you maybe briefly explain the difference between the various subfields of psychology that you mentioned here?
Well, yeah. So, my area is social psychology. Do you want me to talk about them or just sort of identify them?
You can very briefly maybe explain, the differences between them, what they are concerned with, maybe there are different methods. I mean, because the way you described it, some subfields of psychology seem to have arrived at valid conclusions on this problem, whereas others haven't. So I'm just curious about.
Yeah. So in this case, the main sort of dividing point is between social psychology and educational psychology. Social psychology is, concerned with sort of both basic processes and sort of some people try to apply them in the real world to sort of alleviate social problems. The sort of most common definition of social psychology, which is fairly reasonable, is it's the attempts to understand how people think, feel about, and interact with other people. It's social psychology. It's the psychology of dealing with other people. And so in social psychology, you'll have everything from sort of self and identity to social and political attitudes, and then stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. All this involves thinking about either oneself in a social context or about other people. So educational psychology is, what it sounds like, sort of the psychology of what goes on in the classroom and in educational practice and in academic achievement and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. The method of choice for social psychologists is mostly the experiment. Social psychologists will do some non-experimental work, but it's mostly experimental. Educational psychologists will do some experiments, but it's mostly non-experimental because they're looking at classrooms. You can sometimes do experimental interventions in classrooms, but a lot of the work is naturalistic. Mm-hmm. So that's the main point there. So both are different than clinical psychology, which is really, the study of sort of essentially psychopathology and how people go wrong and, how to get them back.
Yes.
Back on sort of sound and psychological and emotional footing. You have cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology really bridges everything from building blocks of perception. So what are the processes by which the eye and the visual system can distinguish, a square from a squiggle, in the stimulus array that, you're hit with when you're looking at a room or an outdoor scene. So sort of building blocks of perception all the way up to, sort of macro level decision making. How do CEOs and politicians make decisions about what kind of economic policy to develop, to whether or not to go to war? So it's everything from these sort of very basic, sort of building block things up to these very, very sort of global judgments and decisions. So then you have, it used to be biological psychology. Now it's often called either neuropsychology or psychological neuroscience or behavioral neuroscience, which is the sort of the physiological and biological underpinnings of psychological functioning. A lot of that is done with non-human animals because it's kind of hard to muck around in the brains of humans. It's a lot easier often to work with rats or monkeys or chimps or whatever it might be. But some of that's done with humans also.
Mm-hmm.
There's a zillion sub-areas of psychology. There's health psychology, which is sort of the psychology of health and illness. There's just this peace psychology. It just sort of goes, right? There's just like, there's probably like 50 or 80 different sub-branches. There's sort of organizational psychology, which is kind of like a mix of social psychology and cognitive psychology applied in organizational contexts. So,
okay.
I think I'll stop there.
So I just picked up on something, which is, so you explained that social psychologists carry out what you called experiments. So
yes.
What does that exactly mean? Does that mean that they have people in closed settings, so to say, in sort of predetermined scenarios, and they examine the reactions?
Yeah, that's a pretty good quick summary. I mean, some experimental studies will take place actually in a laboratory. So people will come to the lab, and the experiment will involve putting some people in one situation and another people in an almost but not quite identical situation to see how they react to the different situation. And when I say different situation, I mean, in my area, in my initial area, which was a lot of work on expectations and stereotypes, the simple stereotype study would be to have people evaluate two high school applicants to college, two resumes. Everything is held identical, except, and then you manipulate some group membership. Could be race, could be gender, could be sexual identity, could be political party. But, you hold everything constant except that one variable. And then you see, do people evaluate, an otherwise identical male resume more or less positively than a female resume? So that would be that would be a typical stereotype experiment. But there's those experiments on all sorts of things, and you can do this. You don't need to do these things in the lab. Some of the large nationally representative sort of ongoing surveys. So in the U.S., there's the General Social Survey, and there's the American National Election Study. These have been going on for years and years. I think they have multiple waves a year. You can also run an experiment embedded in a survey. So if you want to know how order of questions influences the responses, well, you give half the people one order and you give half the people another order, and then you simply compare, do you get a different level of support for some attitude thing, whether it's abortion or Trump or whatever it might be, based simply on the order of the question. So you can easily embed experiments into surveys.
This sounds pretty empirical. So
yeah,
I'm a bit surprised in this sense that they could, social psychologists, if they did empirical research of this type, could get this.
Yeah. So social psychology, definitely not in the same universe as the sort of postmodern social constructionist stuff that sort of dominates large sections of sociology and anthropology and even some sections of political science.
Yes.
And almost completely throughout the humanities and sort of women's or gender studies or various studies programs that are out there now. No, with social psychology, I mean, we're imperfect. So have you heard the term replication crisis?
I have, yes.
Okay, right. So this hit about 5-6 years ago, where it really became clear that some of our, and talking mostly social psychology, sometimes outside of psychology, and this hit other fields also, but I'm talking about social psychology now. Some of our most cherished findings either didn't replicate or had real trouble replicating. So it's sort of, that triggered a set of controversies, and we now have a growing reform movement to make the field even more rigorous. And, it started 4 or 5 years ago. So in the grand scheme of things, it's relatively new. It remains controversial. Not everyone buys either how bad it is. Some people think that the validity of the field is really shaken by the replication crisis. Other people think, yeah, that's overblown. It's not quite that bad. But regardless of all that, I am not certain, but confident that many of the reforms being led by what I'm calling the science reform movement will actually improve the sort of the validity of the science that emerges from psychology. So it may not, may not in every field. Maybe some subfields don't even need it, but overall, I'm sure this is going to be a beneficial effect on the field. So that's actually a really interesting thing to me, because as many of the other social sciences seem to be, again, not all, there's certainly hardcore empirical political science and hardcore quantitative empirical sociology, but the sort of heavy domination by social constructionist and ethnography and postmodernist and sort of neo-Marxist stuff, as that gains of more and more momentum in other fields, actually psychology is moving in the exact other direction. So that, I knew that social psychology, or I believed it had serious problems long before the replication crisis hit, actually. And that was one of the themes of my 2012 book, was that with respect to self-fulfilling prophecies and expectancies, the field just went wrong time and time again in just a million ways. So I was really kind of excited when the science reform movement bloomed. And I am actually more optimistic about my field than at any other time prior to, any other prior time in my career.
Very nice. So we can talk a bit about stereotypes. So it's probably a consensus in polite society, at least, that stereotypes say nothing real about the world and say a lot about the people who hold them. These people, people who hold stereotypes are considered to be ignorant and riddled with prejudice. However, your research has shown that stereotypes are accurate, as you put it. So can you explain to the audience what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So let's back. Yeah. So that, for that to make any sense, there are two things I need to explain. I need to explain what the hell a stereotype is to me. Like, someone else is free to define it differently, but when I say stereotypes are accurate, what counts is how I define stereotypes. And then I have to tell you what I mean by accuracy. So actually, accuracy is really simple and straightforward. It's not, sometimes to assess it empirically is not simple and straightforward, but conceptually, it's really simple and straightforward. And that is, does some belief correspond to some reality without having caused it? So if my belief causes the reality, that would be a self-fulfilling prophecy and would not be accuracy. But if I predict that it's going to rain tomorrow and it rains tomorrow, I didn't cause the rain tomorrow, so my prediction is accurate. And the same thing with social beliefs. If I predict that the Democrats are going to take control of the House of Representatives in the next election, and they do, then I was right. I certainly did not. I don't have the power to shift power, the balance of power in the United States government. So that would simply be right. And it would be just as right if I'm dealing with, somebody I know personally. If I, believe my wife is going to spend 4 hours working tomorrow, and if we could assume that I did not cause her to spend the time working, and if she does work 4 hours tomorrow, then I accurately predicted how much she was going to work tomorrow. So that's basically, accuracy is at its core very, very simple. It's, does the belief correspond to the reality? Okay, so then what about a stereotype? Well, often when people think about stereotypes, they kind of define stereotypes as being sort of bad and pernicious and inaccurate. And well, of course, if you define them as inaccurate, then they have to be inaccurate, right? I mean, but that's not an empirical question. It's a definitional one. Then what becomes the empirical question is any particular belief a person holds a stereotype? Because if you define stereotypes as inaccurate and the belief is accurate, then you've defined it away as not being a stereotype.
Yes.
Right. So if you declare a stereotype to be, by definition, inaccurate, and someone says, well, men are taller than women, you would have to say that is not a stereotype. Right? Okay. So the problem with this, there's two problems with defining stereotypes as inaccurate, at least in social psychology and most of the social sciences. One is that empirically, if you look at the kinds of things that have been studied as stereotypes in social psychology and other social sciences, it's pretty much any kind of grouping you can imagine. So it's the big demographic groups, race and gender and age and social class and religion and all the ones that you would think. But it's also politics, it's college majors, it's the dorms that college students live in, it's occupations, it's even invented groups that don't exist, it's aliens from other planets. It's just like any group, as far as I can tell, it's any grouping you can imagine. So if you assume that then a stereotype means any group whatsoever and any grouping, then and if your claim is that all stereotypes are inaccurate, then your claim is logically incoherent. And it's logically incoherent because it would mean, for example, that believing that two groups are different is inaccurate, and believing that they're the same is inaccurate. Those are mutually exclusive. That's not possible. So in that sense, they're logically incoherent. But there is another possibility that if you define stereotypes as inaccurate, you don't mean all beliefs about all groups are inaccurate. What you mean are some beliefs about groups are inaccurate. Those are stereotypes. But the others that are not inaccurate, that are accurate, those would not be stereotypes. So far, this is not logically incoherent. The problem with that view is that in order to engage in the empirical study of stereotypes, and there are, I don't know how many thousands, or maybe at this point, maybe tens of thousands of studies on stereotypes. I mean, if I go into Google Scholar, I bet you the number of hits would probably be in 6 digits, not even 5 digits, might even be in 7 digits. So if you define stereotypes as inaccurate, you cannot even be in the business of investigating a stereotype unless you first demonstrate empirically that the belief is inaccurate. No one ever does that. Ever.
Yeah.
I've been making this claim for about 20 years. It's never been done. Obviously, a single example could prove me wrong. No one has ever come up with a single example. So if that's your definition, that not all beliefs about groups are inaccurate, stereotypes are inaccurate beliefs, it requires the literature to first demonstrate inaccuracy in order to study stereotypes. Because no one has ever done that,
yes,
that means there is nothing in our literature that we know studies stereotypes. So the person who would define it that way would be logically incoherent if they referred to any empirical finding regarding stereotypes, because none can possibly be known to have investigated stereotypes, because nobody first showed that the belief was inaccurate. So for me, the idea that stereotypes are inaccurate is logically incoherent. It's logically incoherent for either of two reasons. And there's a really simple solution to that, and that is to simply not define stereotypes as inaccurate. You don't have to define them as accurate. They're simply beliefs about groups, just like beliefs about anything else, beliefs about the weather, beliefs about the real estate market, beliefs about politicians, beliefs about climate change. People have zillions of beliefs. Some are right or some are wrong. Some are like kind of right, but not perfectly right. Some are like, kind of pretty much wrong, but not completely wrong. Stereotypes are exactly the same as all those other beliefs, except that they're about people. That then turns the issue of their accuracy into an empirical question, rather than sort of being resolved by definition. Now, once it becomes an empirical question, and really all that means is you need to assess the extent to which people's beliefs about groups correspond to what those groups are actually like. Now, you can't always do that because there isn't good information on what groups are actually like for all sorts of things. But there are criteria, standards for what groups are like for many things. And for the things that there are good standards and criteria, for those you can assess the accuracy.
Yes. Yeah, we would need data both on people's beliefs and data on, well, the actual, the actual things on which the beliefs,
that's right,
apply, so to say.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so, and you have sort of done that, if I understand correctly, because you have concluded that a fair number of, stereotypes, so to say, that people hold are actually pretty accurate. So how did you go about to?
Yes, so I mean, most of that conclusion is based on a fairly large body of work, only a tiny sliver of which is actually mine. My kind of role or contribution is like pulling it all together and saying, boy, when you look at the big picture, when you put all the stuff together, it really looks like, whether it's my research or others people's research, whether it's research on gender stereotypes or racial stereotypes or ethnic stereotypes or age stereotypes or these like quirky stereotypes like occupational statuses and dorm residences, when you put it all together with some notable exceptions, by and large, people's beliefs correspond to the real group characteristics pretty damn well. So, yeah, there's probably about 50 studies now, maybe even more at this point. And it's not like all 50 studies show that pattern, but most do.
So can you give some examples of people's beliefs that are accurate?
Yeah. So probably the earliest sort of clear investigation of the accuracy of racial stereotypes was done in the late 70s, in the United States. And people from various walks of life were asked to estimate the prevalence of various characteristics among African Americans versus other Americans. So African Americans compared to your average other American. And I'm actually calling up the paper right now because it's like, I could do this from memory, but it'll take me 2 seconds to call up the paper. So, and what they were asked was all stuff that's in the United States Census data. So it's very easy to compare people's beliefs about these things to the pretty strong evidence. So the characteristics were how likely were they to have completed high school, or what proportion of African Americans versus other Americans completed high school, were born into a single parent versus married home, were unemployed last month, were victims of crimes, were on welfare, came from families with 4 or more children, or came from a female head of family. And the correlations of people's beliefs with the group characteristics was like 0.8 to 0.9.
Wow.
So it's just staggeringly high. And that was kind of on the high side. The overall, so there's different aspects of accuracy. It's not like one is right or one is wrong. But in that particular study, they measured they assessed accuracy in the way that tends to produce these strong accuracy correlations. So overall, I would say the literature doesn't, that's at the high end, but the common findings are correlations of between 0.5 and 0.8 or 0.9 between people's stereotypes and what the groups are actually like. This particular study used census data, and that is a common thing in stereotype accuracy studies, is to use census data because it's, it's such a clear standard, it's such a strong standard. But other studies have used meta-analyses of group differences. If I say meta-analysis, do you need me to explain that?
Maybe for the audience.
Yeah, okay. So, for example, in work assessing the accuracy of gender stereotypes, one of the things that became really common about 15, 20 years ago, for a long time, most empirical studies would just include some sex difference comparison. Maybe it wasn't the main purpose of the study, but maybe the phenomena differed for men and women. You never really know. So this data was in tons of studies. So that then allowed other researchers to compile hundreds, sometimes thousands of studies that assessed sex differences and all sorts of characteristics. Everything from physical and biological characteristics to psychological characteristics. And so what a meta-analysis is a quantitative sort of synthesis or combination of those studies. So let's say there are 100 studies that have administered a questionnaire assessing how agreeable men or women are. So this is one of the, in psychology, it's known as one of the big five. There's the big five personality factors. Much of personality can be captured by them, by these sort of five characteristics. It's somewhat controversial itself, but there's also a lot of research supporting it. One of those is agreeableness. People vary on how agreeable, disagreeable they are. And it turns out there's pretty good evidence that men and women consistently, men are more disagreeable than women. Women are more agreeable than men.
Yes.
And I actually don't know the effect size offhand. I just don't remember. But the meta-analyses would come along and they would, they would perform this sort of a cosmic quantitative analysis of scores of studies or hundreds of studies or sometimes thousands of studies and say, on average, the difference between men and women in agreeableness is such and such.
Yeah.
Okay. So that then allowed stereotype researchers to see if, how well people's beliefs about the agreeableness of men and women corresponded to the sort of well-established levels of agreeableness among men and women. So that would be, so there was lots of work on the accuracy of stereotypes, especially gender stereotypes, that has used meta-analyses as the standard rather than census. So, the census is not going to report information on how agreeable men or women are, but meta-analyses will. So, so that's another fairly good standard. So there are others, but those are probably the two most common. And they're in political areas, in political stereotypes, the standard will often be people's reported attitudes. So, I'm making this up now. I'm not sure if anybody did this, but it would be easy enough to do a study of the accuracy of stereotypes about men's and women's, or blacks and whites, or any racial or ethnic group, blacks, whites, Latinos, Asians, voting for Trump versus Clinton in the last election. We have the numbers, so you could usually do that. There are also those recurring nationally representative studies, the American National Election Study and the General Social Survey. Both of those routinely ask people's attitudes, attitudes towards various issues, whether it's global warming or gay marriage or military spending. And it's very easy to, ask people what do they believe about Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, men and women, blacks, whites, Latinos, beliefs about any of these issues. And then you have the data on what their actual positions are. So these are all sorts of fairly easy criteria for many kinds of stereotypes. Not all, but many. And when people do that, the stereotypes are usually, they correspond moderately to highly with the criteria.
Okay, so people usually use the words stereotype and prejudice in the same breath, but should we conclude on the basis of your research and other people's research, as you said, should we conclude that stereotypes are often actually based on post-judice, so on people's empirical assessment of the anecdotal evidence that they have at their disposal?
Right. Well, so I'm quite willing to buck, the dominant trends in my field, but in this way, I'm really very traditional. And I would say most, and I think there's a strong consensus for this, most social psychologists would distinguish between stereotypes and prejudice, where stereotypes are, in general, primarily the sort of cognitive or belief component of sort of how people think about groups. So now that belief component can have sort of an emotional or attitudinal or an evaluative component. So if I think you and members of your group are stupid, well, obviously that has an evaluative component, right? Right, and so that's probably a weird mix of stereotype and prejudice. Prejudice is usually distinguished from stereotypes as being the attitude or emotional or evaluative sort of take on another group. And there is obviously there's some overlap between them, but they're separable. So, the stupid phrasing is so harsh that it would most likely actually reflect some degree of prejudice. On the other hand, recognizing that certain racial, ethnic, and gender groups are more or less likely to graduate from high school or college, that's a belief. I mean, it may have a valuative tone to it, but this is primarily a belief. And it's a belief that can be, sort of measured against the reality. Now why the different groups have different levels of educational achievement, that's kind of a different issue. And if my explanation is some groups are stupid and others are smart, well, then underlying my even accurate belief about achievement, educational achievement differences might still be some prejudice. But the belief about the achievement differences, I would say, is primarily a stereotype.
Maybe we can move the conversation to political bias in academia and take, as a base for our discussion, we can take the article that you published with Jonathan Haidt, Charles Stern, and 3 other researchers in the journal Behavior and Brain Sciences.
Sure.
So this article was published in 2015, and the title is Political Diversity Will Improve Social Psychological Science. And you made 4 main claims in this article. And if that's fine with you, we can go through them one by one so that we can discuss them in some detail if you have some time, and present at least some of the evidence that, sort of bolsters these claims.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's easy enough. I mean, basically, the social sciences and humanities, and maybe academia more broadly, has undergone a political purity spiral. It's not my term. That's actually Uri Harris's term. He's a philosopher. I'm actually not sure what discipline he's in. You might be following him. I mean, I tag him all the time.
I am following him on Twitter, yeah.
And he coined that term purity spiral, which I think really does capture it. So we documented this in 2015 in psychology, that if you go back 60 or 70 years, there were always a few more liberals than conservatives in the field. Maybe it was 2 to 1 for a long time. But really, since about 1980, I'm tempted to call it a purge. It has elements of a purge because of the sort of outright sort of discrimination and hostility directed towards conservatives. But it's not an organized purge in the same sense as the Stalinist purges in the 30s or something like that. And there's a big self-selection component as well. So it's not all, discrimination and hostility on the part of the existing, mainly left academics. But regardless, empirically, actually, we documented in that article how in psychology, sort of the ratio of Democrats and Republicans over the last 70, 80 years went from about 2 to 1 to about 14 to 1. But at least in social psychology, it's actually much worse than that. There was in my 2000 the recent edited book, The Politics of Social Psychology, there's a chapter by von Hippel and Buss in which they surveyed social psychologists and asked them who they voted for in the 2012 election. So this is not the really divisive Trump-Clinton election. This is 2012, right? It was 301 for Obama and 4 for Romney.
Wow.
That's 75 to 1.
Yep.
And I'm not making a case. I'm not saying anybody did anything more. I'm certainly not making a case that they should have or should not have, who they should have voted for. That's not the point at all. The point is we have this massive ideological skew, and purity spiral is a good way to describe it. I mean, there will be no conservatives in the field very soon. 0. I mean, we're at 1 out of 75 now. It's going to be 0. We're headed towards 0.
Yeah, and not only no conservatives, but essentially probably very, very few libertarians, very few moderates.
Right. That's right. I mean, that's part of this purity spiral. And there's good evidence on this as well. It's not just conservatives. I've never seen actually data on libertarians, but I would say anecdotally, moderates and libertarians kind of feel the hostility almost as much as do the few remaining conservatives in the field.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's not, the truth is, it's not even moderates. It's not even restricted to moderates, libertarians, or conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
Even people who are strongly on the left, if their research takes them to a place that contests some cherished leftist narrative, they get all sorts of hell heaped on them. So that was actually, there were a couple of chapters in the in that book, The Politics of Social Psych, by people who do evolutionary psychology. And the chapters consistently argued that that subfield of psychology, which attempts to apply principles of evolution to understanding sort of essentially human nature, why people do what they do, sometimes group differences, sometimes individual differences, has received sort of vicious and mostly irrational pushback. Now, I don't want to overstate that. Evolutionary psychology has its imperfections, and there have been evolutionary psychology experiments that have failed to replicate. So, evolutionary psychology is not immune to any more immune to criticism than any other scientific field should be. But it doesn't seem that the problem is that it's too immune. The problem seems to be that it generates this kind of irrational hostility over and above whatever reasonable skepticism may be out there.
Okay, so that was claim 1 out of the 4 from your article. So claim 1 is, there is this extremely lopsided ratio among political leanings in the social sciences. So then there is claim 2, which is, so you claim that this lack of political diversity can undermine the validity of social psychological science via mechanisms such as the embedding of progressive values into research questions and methods. Yeah.
Hold on a second. Let's go here. Because it was really the recent edited book, that dealt with that at extended length. I mean, it was a whole book. There were like 30 different authors. Wow. So I'm just going to read you some of the titles of some of those chapters.
Okay.
All right? Because these titles will mostly answer that question. Do ideologically driven scientific agendas impede the understanding and acceptance of evolutionary principles in social psychology? So that's the von Hippel and Buss. Their answer is a resounding yes. Does political ideology hinder insights on gender and labor markets, especially inequality, whether it's STEM or the pay gap? And this is by Charlotta Stern. And again, her answer is a resounding yes. All right. My favorite chapter, probably from the book, is this one by Christine Reyna. Scale creation, use, and misuse. How politics undermines measurement. And the reason it's my favorite in the book is the idea that political ideology has, and is continuing to seep into how we social psychologists create, construct, test, and validate our measures is kind of mind-blowing.
Okay.
So jumping to conclusions, advocacy and application of psychological research. So that's great. Well, that's mainly about implicit bias and the idea that there was a highly premature leap to bring that into the real world before the work had been fully vetted by the scientific community. So you have that. And then, there's more. I could go on like that. So, but that's really what that was about. It was, most of the book was on how people, these are all social psychologists. And I mean, I just gave you it's 301 out of 305. So you have the reasonable assumption is that almost everybody who contributed to this book is left of center in their politics. Even if there's some self-selection bias, maybe we bagged a few of the, a slightly disproportionate number of people who were not quite as far left as everybody else. But the base rate is so high that you have to assume that almost everybody who contributed to my book is left of center in their personal politics. And yet, what do we have? We have 15 chapters on how really leftist politics distorts the science of the field.
Okay. So yeah, I will try and look up this book then. It seems a very interesting source. Okay, so the third claim is that increased political diversity would improve social psychological science by reducing the impact of bias mechanisms such as confirmation bias and by empowering dissenting minorities to improve the quality of the majority's thinking.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of quality of thinking 101, right? That when everybody, and it really is just about everybody at this point, it's no longer even like some sort of exaggerated histrionic thing, but when everybody is holding essentially the same political view, then you have most people sharing kind of certain fundamental aspects of the worldview and assumptions. And, groups, it's very easy for groupthink and sort of presumptions about how the world works to sort of seep in. And there's no one there motivated to challenge it. So this is, I believe that this is one reason everybody and their brother, quote, knows, unquote, that stereotypes are inaccurate. Because the idea that stereotypes are inaccurate, despite being completely logically incoherent, is a great rhetorical device for both signaling one's commitment to social justice and advancing one's claims about advancing social justice by condemning those who are filled with bigotry and hatred and irrational beliefs. So, I get the politics of it, right? And the idea that occurs among lay people, it's like, okay, well, lay people are, you don't really, pretty unreasonable to assume that lay people have thought about these issues in the same way and extent as social scientists. So I'm willing to be very forgiving of lay people kind of not getting all that. But I'm not really willing to be forgiving of my colleagues for not getting all that. That's kind of their job to understand these issues. And it's a major failing when this claim that stereotypes are inaccurate or mostly inaccurate or typically inaccurate or stereotypes have a kernel of truth, but other than that, they're biased and they exaggerate real differences, that all this apparently has like a life of its own, independent of both the logic and the data. So no, that where is that coming from? I believe that's coming from the politics of the field infecting their claims about the science. So that's with respect to stereotypes. It's also with respect to self-fulfilling prophecies. It's also with respect to implicit bias. That's it's for a whole nother area is that after World War II, there was social science interest in what led to fascism, and that led eventually to an entire literature on what's now called right-wing authoritarians. And this is a gigantic literature.
Yeah, it was launched, among others, by Adorno, if I'm correct.
You're right. That's exactly right. And you're right. So it started like in the 40s and 50s. It's alive and well now. So it's now, like 70 years worth of research. And for most of that time, there were people who would say, well, what about left-wing authoritarians? And people would say, well, that's a good point. And so they would try and look for evidence of left-wing authoritarianism and just could never find it. Could never find it. Just can't find it. And it's like the field can't find the evidence, and yet, so for whatever 50 years, the world was filled with Stalin and Mao. Like, there's something wrong with that picture. Like, how is this even possible? That we just can't find it. Just can't find it. So amazingly, within the last year, I don't remember whether it was 2017 or 2018, a paper takes the most common measure, the most common questionnaire for assessing right-wing authoritarianism, and simply flips a couple of the items to have right-wing targets rather than left-wing targets. And lo and behold, there are left-wing authoritarians. And there's about as many of them as there are right-wing authoritarians. So why did it take the field 70 years to figure out, all we have to do is switch the target? And to me, that is your classic evidence of a blind spot. So yeah, I really, it's really funny. You follow me on Twitter, so I don't know. I mean, sometimes I get into these like arguments, so I realize, not everybody's paying rapt attention to everything I write about. But periodically, somebody will post some article, and I'll say some variation of, "This is bullshit. I don't buy it." And then I'll give reasons why I don't buy it. I'll thread something. I'll present counter evidence. And then like a bunch of people will chime in. You should write an essay on that. You should do a Quillette article on that. It's like, I have a life. I can't plug my finger into every one of these stupid dikes. But if there were more people motivated to contest these narratives in the field, there would be, these contrary perspectives would emerge, naturally. They'd emerge, because there are more people who kind of see these kind of problems, perhaps because they're motivated, and just because they'd be motivated. I mean, I would only write something because I believed I was right. But stepping back from that, I mean, I recognize that not everything I have ever written or ever will write is necessarily correct. That's why you have a dialogue and dialectic and all this kind of thing. But when sort of half the sort of moral political order is excluded from that discussion, it's very hard to have that kind of dialogue.
Okay. So we can go briefly over the fourth and last claim, which is in your hypothesis, the underrepresentation of non-progressives in social psychology is most likely due to a combination of self-selection, hostile climate, and discrimination.
Oh yeah, I mean that. There's actually pretty good evidence for most of that. Although the three overlap.
Yes.
Right. So, but they don't overlap completely. It's really interesting. So I'm in New Jersey, right, in the United States, and I routinely run studies on introductory psychology students. So this is common in psychology. If you're doing work with human subjects, often you'll use intro psych students. And for years, we've been collecting data on their political identities, whether are they Democrat, Republican, or something else? Do they identify as liberal, conservative, or something in between, or something else? So I have a lot of data on this. And it's really, really interesting because in New Jersey, going back to at least 2004, I'd have to double check the numbers, but between about 55 and 60% of the state votes for Democrat, in the last several elections, has voted for the Democratic candidate.
Yeah.
So that gives you some sense of the division in the state. However, there's pretty good evidence that liberals are more likely to go to college than are conservatives, even from the get-go. And psychology is sort of mostly a social science, probably has more appeal to people on the left than the right. And so even these intro psych students break out as, at least in those earlier data, about 2/3 to even 3/4 left versus right. Now, they have not experienced any hostile environment, any blatant discrimination, political discrimination. But those numbers are still higher than, say, the statewide elections.
Yes.
So there's some and obviously you can't become a social psychologist, or you can't get a PhD in psychology for the most part, unless you take an introductory psychology class. So intro psych is the gateway to like everything else.
Yeah.
But even as they arrive in intro psych, they are already more left than the rest of the state. So that's pure, that's pure self-selection.
But one could make the case that young people usually are, tend to lean more on the left of the political spectrum than the rest of the population. So maybe one would need to, compare the population of psychology students or social psychology students to people from their, age cohort.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. So, I don't really, do I have those data? We sort of do have those data. We are getting those data now because we've begun doing research with students from outside of psychology. And they are slightly more, they're not exactly more conservative, they're less liberal. The disproportion is somewhat lower, university-wide than in psychology. So I think you have two things. I think you have people who attend college tend to be more liberal than their general population. And then people who even take the first psychology class are more liberal than the typical college student. So, and that's mostly self-selection. There may be other things going on to some degree, but that's mostly self-selection. But then once you get there, self-selection is a weird thing. If we know the field is dominated by people on the left, that means the questions being asked, the research questions being asked by psychologists are the questions of interest to people on the left, because that's who's in the field.
Yeah.
So that's like true almost by definition. Like that's not a brilliant insight on my part. Now, there's lots of topics where you really wouldn't expect ideology to play much of a role. So even though there are questions that people on the left want answered, there's often not any reason to think they're very different than the kinds of questions people on the right would want to answer. So if you're studying the neurological or hormonal bases of learning, of association learning or higher order cognitive learning, it's sort of hard to imagine much of a role in ideology in any of that. But if you're dealing with anything that is remotely related to social issues, and some things are more related to social issues than they might seem. So one of the big sort of claims or findings in social psychology is talked about as being the power of the situation, right? So that, at least conceptually, what are the main influences on human behavior? You can break it up to things inside the person, their personality, their attitudes, their beliefs, their goals, their motivations, things about the person versus their situation. And situation sounds vague and abstract, but the situation might be other people. So, if you're on the job and your boss is warm and friendly versus cold and harsh, that's a different situation. If you're given orders by your boss to do unethical things, how do you react to that? It's your boss. You're going to risk losing your job just because your boss told you to do something unethical? Well, maybe not. But the upshot of the power of the situation is that people are much more influenced by situations than most of us would ever have thought. Okay, so what does that have to do with how? It doesn't sound ideological at all, except I suspect that it is, actually. And I suspect that it is because the left is mainly about people's circumstances.
Yes.
It's sort of understanding those circumstances. It's creating social programs to alleviate people's bad circumstances. There's, compared to the right emphasizes sort of willpower and personal responsibility and things about the person. It's not quite, that's sort of stark. And it's not absolute on the left, and it's not absolute on the right. And I don't mean to be saying that it is, but you do have these differing emphases on the left and the right. And so the emphasis in social psychology on the power of the situation, which might seem like a sort of apolitical, purely empirical intellectual idea, I suspect has been infected with liberal ideology and liberal values. It turns out really interesting that empirically, people have actually examined over the last 10 years or so, maybe going back a little further, whether situations or personal characteristics are stronger predictors of people's behavior. For decades, the lore in social psychology was that situations are powerful, much more powerful than individual differences. That turns out not to be the case, that they're actually both really similar. If you actually compare the studies that have looked at personal factors and situational factors, and you look at the effect sizes are about the same. So probably that means that situations still are more influential than most people think. I think most people probably do walk around most of the time, not always, thinking that they're kind of in charge of their life, except when, in extreme circumstances. So I think people probably do underestimate the power of the situation, but I also think for a very long time, social psychologists overestimated the power of the situation. And that's still part of the lore. It's part of the canon. And I think it does reflect the sort of the liberal. I mean, it's like 5 years ago, I would have talked about the liberal tilt of the field. But it's like it's worse than a tilt at this point. It's like just keeled over, and it's not literally completely left, because there are a tiny number of conservatives, there are a tiny number of people who don't identify on the left, but that number is shrinking fast. So.
Okay, so I reached the end of my questions, so I don't know if you have something to add to that. I mean, we could continue, of course, but I want to stay mindful of your time.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you want to add something before we wrap up.
I don't think so. You hit, the interview hit a lot of the kind of the main things that I do. I actually became interested in both the science reform movement and the problems of sort of political distortion of the work through the stuff on self-fulfilling prophecies and stereotypes. It was like the evidence was vividly clear, and yet the canon, the ideas that pervade the literature are disconnected from the evidence, which kind of raises the question, why the hell is this happening? Well, we present ourselves, we aspire to be a real science. Science should be driven to conclusions based on the empirical evidence. And yet in these areas, we have not completely, but consistently fallen short.
Okay, well,
that's probably a good ending.
Yeah. It's a stark conclusion, not a very positive one. But if it's the one that the data dictates, then
I'm cautiously optimistic that the science reform movement will help. Now, I am a little worried. You combine the science reform movement, which is pushing in a good direction, with the sort of political purity spiral, and what we may end up with is a field that produces really good answers to questions that liberals want to ask.
Okay.
And I that would be my prediction, actually.
I see.
So, which would be an improvement mostly, because we've had really bad answers to questions anybody has wanted to ask. So having good answers to questions liberals want to ask, even I would say, is an improvement of simply having bad answers. But obviously, it does cut out about half the answers half the questions that the world would want to answer.
So listen, we can probably stop here. I want to thank you once more for coming on the podcast.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and let me know when it's posted, and I'll tweet it and all that kind of stuff. So
great stuff. All right, so I really had fun. Thanks for the great conversation.
Thank you, and thanks for waiting the half an hour for my confusion at my end.
Yeah, no problem at all. So thanks again, Professor. And till next time.
Yep.
Have a nice day.
Yeah, you too.